The metal hit the floor with a metallic clink. Just like that. 73 years of service, sacrifice, and memories scattered across the cold linoleum of a government office. Harold Peterson, 89 years old, watched his bronze star roll under a desk like it was nothing more than a dropped coin. The clerk behind the counter didn't even look up from her phone. She was maybe 25, nails painted bright pink, chewing gum with the kind of indifference that cuts deeper than any battlefield wound Harold had ever endured. "Next," she called out, still scrolling. Harold stood there, his weathered hands trembling slightly, not from age, from something much deeper, something that had been building inside him for months as he navigated the maze of bureaucracy that had somehow become his final battlefield. He'd come here to update his veteran benefits, a simple administrative task that should have taken minutes. Instead, he'd been shuffled from office to office, told to fill out forms he'd already completed, asked to provide documentation he'd already submitted 3 times. The young woman finally looked up, annoyed. "Sir," I said next, "you need to move along." Harold's voice was steady, measured, the voice of a man who'd given orders under enemy fire. "Miss, you dropped my medal." She glanced down at the bronze star lying under her desk, then back at her phone. "That's not my job to pick up your stuff. Security will get it later when they sweep. Security will get it later when they sweep." Those words echoed in Harold's mind as he bent down, his old knees protesting, to retrieve the medal that had been pinned to his chest by a general in a ceremony that felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago. The same medal he'd earned crawling through the mud of Normandy, pulling wounded soldiers to safety while machine gun fire shredded the air above his head. But here's what that clerk didn't know. What none of them in that sterile government building knew. Harold Peterson wasn't just any veteran shuffling through their system. And the man sitting quietly in the corner, watching this entire exchange with growing fury, wasn't just any observer, because Colonel James Mitchell, retired Special Forces, had been sitting in that waiting room for the past hour, and he'd seen enough disrespect to last a lifetime. He'd watched Harold be dismissed, ignored, and treated like an inconvenience. And when that medal hit the floor, something inside the colonel snapped. What happened next would be recorded on someone's phone, uploaded to the internet, and watched by millions of people within 24 hours. But more importantly, it would restore something that had been stolen from Harold Peterson that day. Something that, once lost, can never truly be replaced. His dignity. You see, there's a problem in our society that we don't talk about enough. We've become so focused on youth, on technology, on moving fast and breaking things, that we've forgotten the value of experience. We've forgotten that the elderly people we rush past, the veterans we barely acknowledge, carry within them stories that would make our modern problems seem trivial. They've lived through wars we only read about in history books. They've survived economic collapses, social upheavals, and personal tragedies that would break most of us today. Harold Peterson was one of these men. Born in 1934, he'd grown up during the Great Depression, watching his father work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. He'd enlisted in the Army at 17, lying about his age because he wanted to serve his country. He'd fought in Korea, then later in Vietnam. He'd buried friends, carried wounded comrades, and seen things that still visited him in his dreams decades later. When he came home from his second tour, he didn't get parades or thank yous. He got spit on by protesters who called him a baby killer. He got job interviews where employers would suddenly become unavailable when they learned about his military service. He got nights where the only thing that made sense was sitting alone, in the dark, wondering why he'd survived when so many better men hadn't. But Harold persevered. He married his sweetheart, Dorothy, and they built a life together. He worked construction, his back bent over concrete and steel for 40 years. He raised 3 children, taught them about honor, duty, and the importance of treating people with respect. He paid his taxes, voted in every election, and never complained about the nightmares or the chronic pain from shrapnel that doctors said was too dangerous to remove. Dorothy had passed away 3 years ago, and Harold's children lived scattered across the country, busy with their own lives, their own problems. So when his benefits got tangled up in red tape, when forms got lost and appointments got rescheduled, Harold faced the bureaucracy alone, with the same quiet determination that had carried him through decades of service and sacrifice. That's what made what happened in that government office so much more than just a rude clerk dropping a medal. It was a symbol of how we treat our heroes when they're no longer young and strong, when they're not useful to us anymore, when they're just old men taking up space in line, moving too slowly, asking too many questions about forms that seem designed to confuse and frustrate them. Colonel Mitchell had seen this before, too many times. He'd watched proud men and women who'd served their country with distinction get ground down by systems that seemed designed to wear them out, to make them give up and go away. He'd seen veterans die waiting for benefits they'd earned, buried under paperwork and bureaucratic indifference. But this time was different. This time he wasn't going to sit quietly and watch. The colonel stood up, all 6 feet 3 inches of him, and walked over to where Harold was still kneeling, trying to reach his medal. Without a word, Colonel Mitchell bent down and retrieved the bronze star, examining it carefully before handing it to Harold with the respect it deserved. "Korea?" he asked quietly. Harold nodded, his eyes meeting the colonel's. In that moment, they didn't need words. One warrior recognizing another, one generation of service connecting with another. Then Colonel Mitchell did something that would change everything. He turned to face the clerk, who was still absorbed in her phone, and spoke in a voice that could be heard throughout the entire office. "Excuse me, miss?" She looked up, clearly annoyed at being interrupted again. "What?" "I think you owe this gentleman an apology." The clerk's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion to defiance. "For what? I'm just doing my job." "Your job," Colonel Mitchell said, his voice growing louder, "is to serve the people who serve this country. This man earned that medal crawling through enemy fire to save American lives. And you just tossed it on the floor like garbage." Now the entire office was paying attention. Other clerks had stopped their conversations. Veterans waiting in other lines had turned to watch. Someone in the back pulled out their phone and started recording. The clerk's supervisor, a middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit, hurried over. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes," Colonel Mitchell said, never taking his eyes off the clerk. "There's a big problem. This young lady just showed complete disrespect to a decorated veteran, and she needs to apologize. Right now, in front of everyone." The supervisor looked nervous, clearly wanting to de-escalate the situation. "I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding." "No, misunderstanding," the colonel interrupted. "I watched her drop his medal and tell him it wasn't her job to pick it up. I watched her treat him like he was bothering her, instead of recognizing that he's the reason she has the freedom to sit in that chair and collect a paycheck." The office had gone completely silent. The clerk looked around, suddenly realizing that everyone was staring at her. Her phone was forgotten on the counter. For the first time since Harold had walked up to her window, she seemed to understand that this was serious, but she still didn't get it. Not really, because instead of apologizing, she got defensive. "Look, I deal with hundreds of people every day. I can't be expected to stop." Colonel Mitchell's command cut through her excuse like a blade. "Just stop. That man standing next to me has forgotten more about sacrifice and service than you'll ever know. He earned that medal when you weren't even born, fighting for freedoms you take for granted every single day, and you're going to apologize to him, right now." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Harold stood quietly beside the colonel, still holding his bronze star, watching this younger man fight a battle on his behalf that he'd been fighting alone for too long. "If you believe that our veterans deserve better than this, that the men and women who served our country should be treated with the dignity and respect they've earned, then hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next is going to restore your faith in humanity, but it's also going to show you just how far we've fallen as a society. And more importantly, it's going to show you what we can do to fix it." The supervisor was whispering frantically to the clerk, probably explaining to her that this situation was about to become a public relations nightmare for their entire department. Because by now multiple phones were recording, and someone had already started live streaming the confrontation on social media. But Colonel Mitchell wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the office. I think we've gotten so comfortable in our freedom that we've forgotten what it cost. We've forgotten that old men like Harold here gave up their youth, their health, and in some cases their sanity to preserve the way of life we all enjoy today. He gestured toward Harold, who was listening with tears in his eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude that someone finally was speaking up for him. This man enlisted when he was 17 years old. 17. Most of you probably can't imagine making a decision that serious at that age. But Harold Peterson looked at his country and said, "I'll go, I'll serve. I'll sacrifice whatever needs to be sacrificed to keep America free." The colonel's voice was getting stronger, more passionate with each word. The years of watching disrespect, of seeing heroes treated like burdens, were pouring out of him. He fought in Korea in conditions that would break most of us. Frozen ground, enemy fire, watching friends die beside him. And he didn't run. He didn't make excuses. He stayed and fought because that's what Americans do. That's what heroes do. Harold was remembering now. The cold that went beyond anything he'd ever experienced. The weight of gear on his back as he crawled through snow toward wounded soldiers who were crying for their mothers. The sound of incoming mortars that would wake him up screaming for decades afterward. He was remembering Jimmy Martinez, barely 18, who'd stepped on a landmine and bled out in Harold's arms, whispering about a girl back home he'd planned to marry. He was remembering the Bronze Star ceremony, where the general had said his actions saved 6 American lives that day, though Harold had never felt like a hero. He'd just felt like a soldier doing what soldiers do. And when he came home, Colonel Mitchell continued, did he get a hero's welcome? Did he get parades and celebrations? No. He got protests. He got people calling him names, treating him like a villain instead of the hero he was. But did he give up on America? Did he become bitter and angry? No. He built a life. He raised a family. He worked for 40 years, paying taxes and being a productive citizen, never asking for special treatment. The clerk was starting to look uncomfortable, really uncomfortable, because she was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about a dropped medal. This was about decades of accumulated disrespect, of a society that had forgotten how to honor its heroes. And now, the colonel said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more power than his shouting, now when he's old and needs the benefits he was promised, needs the help he's earned, we make him jump through hoops. We lose his paperwork. We make him wait in lines. And when he comes to this office, seeking nothing more than what was promised to him, you treat him like he's bothering you. The silence in the office was deafening. Harold could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of all those years, all that service, all that sacrifice being acknowledged by someone who understood. So I'm going to ask you one more time, Colonel Mitchell said to the clerk. Are you going to apologize to this American hero, or are we going to have a much bigger problem? The clerk looked around the room, at all the phones recording, at her supervisor's worried face, at the crowd of people who were all waiting to see what she would do. But most importantly, she looked at Harold Peterson, standing there with his Bronze Star in his weathered hands, dignity intact despite everything he'd endured. And for the first time, she really saw him, not as an inconvenience or an interruption to her day, but as a human being, as a veteran, as someone who had given up his youth so that she could have hers. What she did next surprised everyone in that office, including Harold, including Colonel Mitchell. She walked around the counter, approached Harold directly, and with tears in her eyes, she said something that would be shared millions of times across social media in the hours that followed. Sir, I am so sorry, not just for dropping your medal, but for not seeing you, for not recognizing what you've done for our country, for not treating you with the respect you deserve. She paused, struggling with emotions she probably hadn't expected to feel. My grandfather was a veteran too, World War II, and if someone had treated him the way I treated you today, it would have broken my heart. I'm ashamed of myself, and I promise you I will never treat another veteran this way again. The change in the room was immediate and powerful. The tension didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else, something that felt like healing. Harold looked at this young woman, really looked at her, and saw something he recognized. Remorse. Real remorse. The kind that comes from understanding, not just from being caught doing something wrong. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more to me than you know." But Colonel Mitchell wasn't quite finished. Because this moment, this apology, was important. But it was also just the beginning of a larger conversation that needed to happen. "This is good," he said, his voice still carrying throughout the office. "This is how it should be. But we can't let this be just one moment. We can't let this be just one apology. Because Harold Peterson isn't the only veteran being treated this way. He's not the only hero being shuffled through systems that don't value his service." He turned to address the entire office, all the clerks and supervisors and administrators who were listening. Every single day, veterans walk through these doors. Men and women who served our country in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in conflicts most of us never even heard about. They come here seeking benefits they've earned, help they've been promised, and too often, they're treated like burdens instead of heroes. The colonel was building towards something. Harold could feel it. Everyone in the room could feel it. We can do better. We have to do better. Because these veterans won't be with us forever. Every day we lose World War II veterans, Korean War veterans, Vietnam veterans. Men and women who carry with them stories and experiences that shaped the America we live in today. And when they're gone, those stories die with them. Harold thought about his friends from the war. Most of them were already gone. Heart attacks, cancer, old age, and sometimes just the accumulated weight of carrying too much for too long. He was one of the few left, and he wouldn't be around much longer either. "So here's what I want everyone in this office to remember," Colonel Mitchell said. "The next time an elderly veteran walks through that door, I want you to think about Harold Peterson. I want you to think about what he sacrificed, what he endured, what he gave up so that you could have the life you have today. I want you to treat him not just as a customer or a case number, but as the hero he is." The supervisor stepped forward, clearly moved by what he'd witnessed. "Colonel, I want to assure you that we're going to make some changes around here. Starting today, we're going to implement new training for our staff, focused on veteran sensitivity and respect, and we're going to make sure that Mr. Peterson's benefits issues are resolved immediately." It was a start, a good start, but Harold had lived long, enough to know that real change takes time, takes commitment, takes people willing to speak up when they see injustice. As the crowd began to disperse, as phones stopped recording and conversations resumed, Colonel Mitchell approached Harold privately. "You okay, soldier?" Harold smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. "Better than okay, Colonel. Thank you for speaking up. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone fight for me. We look out for each other," the colonel said. "That's what we do. That's what we've always done." They stood there for a moment, two veterans from different generations, united by something deeper than age or rank or the wars they'd fought. United by service, by sacrifice, by the understanding that freedom isn't free and that someone has to be willing to pay the price. But this story doesn't end in that government office. Because what happened there, what was recorded and shared and talked about across the country, started something bigger. It reminded people of something we'd almost forgotten. Our veterans matter. Their stories matter. Their dignity matters. And sometimes it takes a moment like this, a medal hitting the floor and a colonel demanding an apology, to remind us all of what we owe the men and women who served. Within hours, the video of Colonel Mitchell's confrontation had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Comments poured in from across the country, from veterans sharing their own stories of disrespect and bureaucratic indifference, from family members who recognized their own loved ones in Harold Peterson's quiet dignity. But more importantly, it sparked conversations in offices and waiting rooms, in families and communities, about how we treat our elderly, how we honor our veterans, and what we can do to be better. Harold Peterson went home that day with his benefits issues resolved, his bronze star safely in his pocket, and something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, people still remembered what his generation had done for America. Colonel Mitchell went home knowing that he'd done what soldiers do. He'd stood up for someone who needed defending. He'd fought a battle that needed fighting. And he'd reminded everyone watching that some things are worth standing up for. The clerk, whose name was Sarah, and who had never really thought deeply about what it meant to serve your country, went home and called her grandfather, the grandfather who'd stormed the beaches of Normandy and never talked about it. She called him and asked him to tell her his stories, because she finally understood that those stories mattered. And across America, people watched that video and remembered. They remembered their own grandfathers and fathers and uncles who'd served. They remembered that freedom isn't something that just happens, but something that has to be earned and protected and honored. They remembered that the old man waiting in line, moving slowly and asking questions about forms, might be the same young man who once crawled through enemy fire to save American lives. Because here's the truth we sometimes forget. Our veterans don't stop being heroes just because they get old. They don't stop mattering just because their wars are in history books now. They don't stop deserving our respect just because they need our help. Harold Peterson's Bronze Star didn't lose its meaning when it hit that office floor. If anything, watching him bend down to pick it up, maintaining his dignity in the face of disrespect, reminded everyone what true heroism looks like. It looks like service without expectation of reward. It looks like sacrifice without complaint. It looks like getting knocked down and getting back up over and over again, because that's what Americans do. But most of all, it looks like an 89-year-old man treating a young woman with kindness and forgiveness, even after she'd treated him with disrespect, because that's what real heroes do. They respond to hatred with grace, to disrespect with dignity, to anger with understanding. That's the America Harold Peterson fought for. That's the America Colonel Mitchell stood up for. And that's the America we all need to remember and protect and honor, one veteran at a time, one moment of respect at a time, one act of dignity at a time. The medal didn't stay on the floor. The hero didn't stay forgotten. The disrespect didn't go unchallenged. And in a world that sometimes seems to have forgotten what honor means, that makes all the difference. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know who deserves better, if it made you think about how we can all do more to honor the veterans in our communities, then I want you to do something right now. Leave a comment below and tell us about a veteran who has impacted your life, because their stories deserve to be told, their service deserves to be remembered, and their dignity deserves to be protected.